Welcome to another edition of JAX TV here from the WJAX in Munich 2013. With me is Jeff Sussna. He's the founder of Engineering.IT, which is actually the URL of his company, so if you want to find him, you can look that up. And Jeff just opened the WJAX 2013 with a keynote, and he was talking about the industrial age which is now appearing, or which we are living in. What is the characterization of this industrial age? Can you give us a short definition what you mean with it?
Sure.
Regarding IT and the new competitive markets?
Sure. So for about the last 200 years, we've been living in the industrial era of manufacturing and large-scale companies and focus on efficiency and that kind of thing. And that's all shifting now. First of all, the economic activity is much more now driven by services than products. There's a focus on knowledge work as opposed to bureaucracy or manual labor. Companies are really being driven by the need for change and innovation as opposed to sort of doing the same thing year after year, better and better. And that's all being driven by computerization. So what's happening is that companies are having to change from a focus on stability to a focus on being able to change very quickly. If you look at a company like Kodak, which happily went along in the film business for 100 years, and then they were disrupted by smartphones and digital cameras, they weren't able to adapt, they weren't able to change. So more and more the defining characteristic of a company's ability to survive in the market isn't whether they can do something well, it's whether they can do something new. And if you look at companies like Kodak or BlackBerry or Nokia or even now Microsoft, they're companies that are struggling to face this disruption where their competitors come in and completely change the conversation and they don't know how to react by changing their own conversation. And from an IT perspective, what these companies need is for us to start building systems that allow them to continually innovate and really tighten the feedback loop so that they can understand where the market is going and follow it as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Giving these demand for systems which allow them to innovate new things, you made up the opposition between complicated and complex. And I think that was a very intriguing point because people usually seems to fail to understand where a thing is complicated and where a thing is complex and what that means for the business. And as far as I understand you, you say start or stop doing complicated things, or do it when they need it, but start to think about complexity and how you cope with it and use it for your business. Can you give us a short insight what you mean by these two words and where the IT can go complex or become complex?
Sure, and we often use the word complex when what we really mean is complicated. And complicated systems are things that have a lot of parts, but the relationships between all those parts are well understood. So a car, for example, you know what's part of the engine and what's part of the drivetrain and what's part of the chassis, and there isn't any confusion, and the parts all work together sort of the way they're told to. A good way to think about it is if you turn the steering wheel to the left, the whole car is going to go to the left, no questions asked. Whereas complexity involves systems where you have a lot of independent agents that are having more fluid relationships with each other. We tend to organize companies as complicated systems. So we have a nice reporting hierarchy where you have the president at the top and then you have divisions and departments, and at the bottom you have employees. But the reality is what you have is a group of individuals, of human beings with different needs and different motivations, and that's where things like politics and fiefdoms arise. So if you bring in a new CEO to your company and the CEO says, okay, now we're going to go left instead of going right, it's not quite as simple as everybody just following along. And in the IT realm, when we look at things like cloud computing and continuous delivery, we start to have an environment that looks a lot more like a complex system than a complicated one. So my company may have different business units that all have their own solutions for online file sharing, for example, none of which are controlled by the central IT department. So there are all these independent agents that are interacting with each other. And we need different strategies to deal with that. Complicated systems, you can manage them through control, and you can predict where failures are liable to happen and what the repercussions are. The problem with complex systems is you can't perfectly control them. And in fact, when you try and control them, you often make things worse. So what you need is a much more loosely coupled, flexible approach where you focus on resilience as opposed to stability. So for example, if you look at a company like Netflix, which runs all of their systems on top of the Amazon cloud, they assume that parts of the cloud will fail all the time. And they engineer their systems assuming failure and assuming that it's their responsibility to be able to recover from that. They even go farther and they use what they call a chaos monkey, which is an automated tool that actually goes out into their production systems and intentionally introduces failures. They do that because they know they can't perfectly test, and they know that they can't perfectly understand this complex cloud computing system. So they have to learn instead, and they have to get better over time. So they will actually intentionally create outages for themselves. And they actually think of that as a good thing because now they're learning something that they otherwise wouldn't have known. So it's a very different, much more responsive, reactive, almost sloppy, but a model that lets you avoid catastrophic failure by being able to incorporate lots of little failures.
Mm-hmm. And given now these two propositions, the one is that we are living in a post-industrial age, and that complexity has advantages over complication. There was an ongoing discussion in the last years in the IT that we have to industrialize the IT. And now for me it seems like a contradiction to what you say. Because industrialization means in that sense that we work in a way that we have parts which we fit together to a perfect object which does exactly one thing, which is intended to do this thing, and that's it. That's the picture of the industrial age. Yeah, you have a product line and everything is perfect in the end of it. Software isn't that way. How does this demand for industrialization of IT fit to your ideas?
Well, I think they're complementary, and I think what people mean by industrialization of IT is particularly on the operations side. We still do a lot of things by handcraft. We will build servers individually by hand. And if we have to build 10 servers that look exactly the same, we'll build 10 servers by hand. And we'll keep a notepad with instructions on how to build the server. So if you look back at industrialization and the idea of interchangeable parts and automation, the assembly line, the idea that you don't build a car by hand anymore. You can build, lots of cars that are all exactly the same with the same set of automated instructions. One aspect of IT is we're really just starting to do that. If you look at tools like Puppet and Chef and things like that, they're really about industrializing the management of components. I think where the post-industrial aspect comes in is when you get to the higher layers. So again, going back to our example of Netflix, they automate everything they possibly can. But they assume that the relationships between the things that they've automated are unreliable. One of their software tools that they've open sourced is called Hystrix, and what it is it allows a service in a service-oriented architecture that needs to talk to another service to make decisions about its reliability. Well, it's too slow, or it's offline, so I'm basically going to cut it off. And then I'll come back later and I'll sort of make sure that it's okay before I talk to it again. So if you think about the relationship between service components, it's a very post-industrial complex systems approach of I'm not going to assume that service A and service B are nicely locked together. I'm going to assume that one might succeed and one might fail. So I think at the layer of components, we're very much entering the industrial age for IT. At the layer of systems, we kind of have to leapfrog that and go from industrialism to post-industrialism. Instead of taking 200 years, we have to take about 3 years.
Mm-hmm. So we have to do quite quick change.
Yes.
And it doesn't only change the system, but so the technical systems, but it also changed the relationship between the customers and the vendors and the producers. because services are not only demanded for technical reasons, the services I can use or consume, but I do also expect a certain service like social media reactions on my demand as a customer to a company. And how far is that also a piece of that what IT has to deliver to the new markets?
I think it's critical. And if you look at DevOps, from my perspective, what DevOps is really about is what customers are asking for in the cloud computing age. Is they're asking for functionality. I need a service that does what I want, but I'm also paying you to run it for me, so I need it available when and how I want it, and that's part of what I expect you to provide. So the challenge for the company is to seamlessly satisfy those business needs. And I think where DevOps is arising, and this idea that we can't think of ops and dev as different things anymore, and we can't put them, necessarily on different floors of the building, really reflects that market reality of what it is that customers are asking for. And yes, partly because of where consumer services are going, partly because people are bringing their own devices with them to work, people are starting to expect that enterprise systems are more like consumer ones. That I can interact with Facebook however I want, whenever I want, from whatever device I want. And I also expect a really high level of user experience. They're bringing that same expectation and say, okay, I'm going to log onto the corporate time tracking system from my mobile device, and I want it to feel very similar to when I'm logging onto Facebook. So on the one hand, we're having to do dev and ops together because that's what our customers are asking for. And at the same time, we're having to go out and meet them in terms of their experience, because they're starting to lose patience with, well, this is a clunky system, but it's an IT system, and that's the way IT systems are.
As it always or often is with good ideas, they sound intriguingly simple when you're talking about that, like we're doing now. But where are the hindrances? Where are the obstacles, and how could the IT industry overcome them?
Well, I think the biggest obstacle is that this isn't just about a new tool set, it's about a new mindset. And more and more, my experience is that I have DevOps tools vendors, for example, coming to me and saying, people are buying our stuff, but they don't know how to use it. They tip up Jenkins and they tip up Chef, and oh, here's this newfangled thing, but I don't really understand what it means. So I think that's the challenge, is we can't do new things in the old way. So it's very much about culture change and organizational change, almost more than it's about tool change. So I think that's the biggest obstacle. And you combine that with the fact that we don't have a lot of time. Companies are starting to talk about, well, maybe the CIO gives way to the CMO, the chief marketing officer or the chief digital officer. Now that may or may not be a good idea, but it's being driven by the fact that companies are in a hurry, and they need us to keep up with them. So we have to make this very profound change in terms of how we think about our jobs, and we have to make it very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for these insights. Hopefully, people are open-minded enough to be fast enough before that happens to it happens to them what happens to Kodak. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.